Imagine working your whole life to reach the top, only to have one powerful man threaten to take it all away. She was a pilot. He was a billionaire with influence. When a simple cup of coffee turned into a war for survival, she had two choices: back down or fight back. But here's the thing about storms. Some pilots don't just survive them. They fly straight through. Stay with us. This story is just getting started. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Nia Caldwell had always believed that the sky was the one place where she could be free. Free from expectations, from judgments, from the unspoken rules that dictated who belonged where. But even at 35, after years of proving herself as a skilled pilot, she knew that wasn't entirely true. The sky had rules too, ones she'd had to work twice as hard to follow, just to be seen as equal. That morning, as she pulled her dark curls into a bun and adjusted her Aero Atlantic uniform in the mirror, she reminded herself to breathe. It was just another day, just another flight. But deep down, she knew that wasn't quite right either. At Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the day had already settled into its usual rhythm. Suitcases rolling, announcements crackling, travelers moving with purpose. Nia walked through the terminal, her pilot's bag slung over her shoulder, past passengers who either didn't notice her or did a double take. She was used to the looks. A black female captain wasn't exactly common. Some people smiled, seemingly impressed. Others, like the middle-aged man in a business suit she'd passed just moments ago, frowned as if something about her existence disrupted their worldview. She'd learned to ignore it, to focus on what mattered. Today, she was scheduled for Flight 417 to New York City, a straightforward route she had flown countless times. Her first officer, Jim Carter, was reliable, and the crew knew their routine. It should have been an easy morning. "Captain Caldwell," a familiar voice called as she neared Skybrew, the airport cafe she stopped at every shift. She turned to see Marcus Reed, the lead flight attendant and one of her closest friends in the airline. His crisp uniform was flawless as always, and he greeted her with an easy smile. "You look like you're already counting the hours until landing," he teased, handing her a coffee before she even had to ask. Nia smirked, taking the cup. "More like counting how many times I'll have to remind people I actually belong in the cockpit." Marcus's expression darkened slightly, but he forced a chuckle. "Same fight? Different day?" "Something like that." He didn't push because he didn't need to. He understood what it meant to be underestimated. As a black man in the airline industry, he had his own battles. But before they could continue talking, a notification buzzed on Nia's phone, a reminder about a last-minute change to the passenger manifest. She quickly glanced at it. A VIP had been added to first class. Some corporate executive. Nothing unusual. She'd flown plenty of them before. She dismissed the alert and turned back to Marcus. "I should head to the gate. Try to make it through without causing a scandal," he joked, giving her a mock salute. Nia laughed, but as she walked away, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that today was going to be anything but routine. As Nia navigated the crowded terminal, she kept her pace steady, mentally running through pre-flight procedures. A few steps away from the gate, she decided to take one last sip of her coffee before heading to the crew briefing. That's when it happened. One moment, she was moving with practiced ease. The next, she felt her body collide with someone solid. Her coffee cup jolted in her hand, its lid popping off, and before she could react, a splash of hot liquid stained the expensive suit of the man she had walked into. The gasps around them were instant. She barely had a chance to mutter an apology before the man turned sharply to face her. His crisp gray suit, now marred by a large brown stain, was the least remarkable thing about him. His presence exuded a kind of practiced authority. His slicked-back blonde hair, the sharp lines of his face, the way his jaw clenched in irritation. And then, the moment of realization. Nia knew exactly who he was. Richard Langford. A name she had heard more times than she could count in aviation circles. A powerful businessman, rumored to have deep financial ties to the airline industry, including Aero Atlantic. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, a slow smirk forming as he took in her uniform. The expression wasn't amusement. It was something sharper. "Well," he said, voice smooth but laced with disdain, "I hope you fly better than you walk." Nia clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay composed. I'm sorry about your suit. It was an accident. Richard took out a silk handkerchief, dabbing at the stain with exaggerated care. An accident, of course. His tone made it sound like an accusation rather than an acknowledgement. She had dealt with men like him before, ones who wielded power like a weapon, who saw people like her as inconveniences rather than professionals. I'd be happy to cover the dry cleaning cost, she said, keeping her voice level. Richard let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. No need for that, Captain. He put deliberate emphasis on the word, as if testing its weight. I have better ways of handling problems. Something in the way he said it sent a warning through her. She should have walked away, should have let it go. But when she turned to leave, he spoke again, low enough that only she could hear. You know, I don't usually trust just anyone to fly my planes. But don't worry. By the time I'm through, you won't be flying much of anything at all. A chill ran down her spine. She spun back to face him, meeting his gaze head on. Is that a threat? Richard tilted his head, his smile widening just enough to reveal something almost predatory. It's a promise. For the first time that day, Nia wasn't thinking about pre-flight procedures or standard safety checks. She wasn't thinking about passengers or flight times. She was thinking about survival. Nia had dealt with arrogance before. She had faced dismissive glances, skeptical questions, and the ever-present shadow of doubt cast by those who believed she didn't belong in the cockpit. But this was different. Richard Langford wasn't just another entitled executive with a superiority complex. He was a man with influence, a man who could pull strings behind closed doors, the kind of person whose words could send ripples through an industry already resistant to change. And he had just made it clear he intended to use that power against her. Nia forced herself to keep moving, even as her heart pounded. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. At Gate B-17, the crew was gathering for the pre-flight briefing. First Officer Jim Carter was already flipping through the flight plan, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his expression as unreadable as ever. Marcus stood nearby, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching her approach with a knowing look. You good? He asked under his breath as she stopped beside him. Fine, she muttered, pulling her tablet from her bag. Just ran into some turbulence a little earlier than expected. His brows lifted slightly, but he didn't press. Instead, he straightened up as the rest of the crew joined in. The briefing was routine. Weather conditions looked favorable. Expected flight duration was just under 2 hours, and passenger count was full, with the VIP section including Richard Langford. That last part made Nia's grip tighten slightly on her tablet. Everything all right, Captain? Jim asked, his sharp gaze flicking up from his paperwork. Nia hesitated for only a second before nodding. All good. Let's get this plane in the air. She wasn't about to let Richard Langford think he had the power to shake her confidence. As they boarded, passengers settled into their seats, the hum of pre-flight chatter filling the cabin. From the cockpit, Nia ran through the standard checks, flipping switches, adjusting controls, syncing with air traffic control. Every movement was second nature, grounding her in the one place where she had absolute control. Until Marcus's voice crackled through the intercom. Captain, there's a passenger in first class requesting to speak with you. Nia already knew who it was. For a split second, she considered ignoring it. Let him sit there, stewing in whatever petty irritation he had decided to entertain himself with. But if there was one thing she had learned in this industry, it was that perception mattered. She exhaled slowly. I'll handle it. Jim shot her a wary glance, but said nothing as she unbuckled her harness and left the cockpit. She found Richard Langford reclined in his first-class seat, a glass of water resting on the tray table in front of him. He looked up at her with an expression of practiced amusement, as if he had been waiting for this moment. I was hoping to see you before takeoff, he said smoothly. Nia crossed her arms. Is there a problem, Mr. Langford? Richard tilted his head. Oh, not at all. I just wanted to make sure we're clear on something. He leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. You're sitting in that cockpit today because I allow it, but don't mistake that for permanence. Nia's jaw tightened. I earned my seat the same way every other pilot here did. Richard's smirk didn't falter. Did you? Or are we all just playing along with the latest diversity initiative? The words hit like a slap. She had worked twice as hard, endured twice the scrutiny, and sacrificed more than most just to be seen as competent, only for men like him to reduce it to a corporate checkbox. She met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I don't need your approval to do my job. Enjoy your flight, Mr. Langford." She turned on her heel before he could say anything else, her pulse hammering as she walked back to the cockpit. She strapped in, flicking switches with a little more force than necessary. Jim glanced at her, but didn't ask. He simply said, "Tower cleared us for takeoff." Nia took the controls. "Then let's get this done." As the plane accelerated down the runway, lifting effortlessly into the sky, she had only one thought. Richard Langford might have power, but so did she. And she wasn't going down without a fight. Cruising at 35,000 feet, the aircraft hummed with the steady rhythm of a smooth flight. The autopilot was engaged, and for a while the cockpit was quiet, just the soft crackle of radio transmissions and the occasional update from air traffic control. But Nia's mind was far from calm. She couldn't shake the conversation with Richard Langford, the smug way he had delivered his warning. It wasn't just arrogance. There was certainty in his words, as if he already knew how this would play out. She needed to be prepared. Her thoughts were interrupted when the cockpit phone buzzed. "Marcus." She picked up. "What's up?" There was a pause. Then, in a voice lower than usual, he said, "You need to see this." Nia exchanged a glance with Jim before unbuckling and stepping out. Marcus was waiting near the galley, phone in hand. He turned the screen toward her. It was an email. No sender, no subject, just a single sentence. "Be careful. He doesn't just make threats, he follows through." A chill ran down Nia's spine. "Who sent this?" she asked, scanning the screen. Marcus shook his head. "No idea. It showed up in my inbox about 10 minutes ago. No traceable address." Nia reread the words, her mind racing. Someone was trying to warn her. Someone who knew what Richard Langford was capable of. She exhaled slowly. "Don't tell anyone else about this yet?" Marcus's expression was unreadable, but he nodded. "What are you going to do?" Nia looked toward the first-class cabin, where Richard was sitting comfortably, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. She wasn't sure yet, but she knew one thing. Whatever game he was playing, she wasn't backing down. Somewhere over the East Coast, turbulence rocked the aircraft, a subtle shift in pressure that barely registered. But for Nia, the real turbulence was just beginning. Nia sat in the cockpit, fingers lightly drumming against the throttle levers, her mind replaying the cryptic email over and over. The words weren't just a vague warning. They felt personal, like someone had been watching, like someone knew exactly what she was up against. Jim glanced over. "Something on your mind, Captain?" She hesitated. "Nothing that'll affect the flight." He didn't look convinced, but he nodded and returned to monitoring the controls. Nia exhaled slowly. She couldn't afford distractions, not at 35,000 feet. But she also couldn't ignore the fact that someone out there had gone out of their way to warn her about Richard Langford. And that meant one thing. This wasn't just about a coffee stain on his suit. 2 hours later, Flight 417 touched down at JFK International Airport without issue. The moment the aircraft rolled to a stop at the gate, Nia unbuckled her harness and stood up. Marcus caught her eye as he passed by the cockpit door. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Depends," she said. "Are you thinking Richard Langford didn't just threaten me for fun?" Marcus gave her a knowing look. Together, they stepped out into the terminal, their usual post-flight routine momentarily forgotten. Passengers moved through the gate area in a steady stream, but one figure lingered, Richard Langford, standing near the exit with his phone in hand. He wasn't typing. He wasn't scrolling. He was watching her. Marcus muttered under his breath, "Guy's got the subtlety of a sledgehammer." Nia squared her shoulders and kept walking. She wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of hesitating. As she passed, Richard gave her a slow, deliberate nod. "Nice landing, Captain," he said smoothly. "For now?" She didn't stop, didn't react, just walked right past him, heart pounding, pulse steady. She could feel his gaze on her back long after she disappeared into the crowd. Back at the Aero Atlantic crew lounge, Nia sat across from Marcus, her untouched cup of coffee growing cold between them. "Let's go over this again." Marcus said. You run into Langford. He acts like the entitled prick he is. Then, bam, some mystery person drops a warning in my inbox about how he follows through on threats. That about sums it up, Nia said, rubbing her temple. Marcus leaned back. And now he's showing up at the gate, making cryptic comments like some Bond villain? Nia sighed. Yeah, that too. There was a beat of silence before Marcus shook his head. Look, I'm just gonna say it. This guy has real power. The kind that doesn't just get you bumped off a flight roster, the kind that makes people disappear from the industry completely. Nia knew he wasn't being dramatic. She'd seen it happen before. Pilots, flight attendants, engineers, people who had pushed back against the wrong executives and found themselves blacklisted overnight. You think I should back off? She asked quietly. Marcus studied her for a moment. I think you should be smart about it. She nodded, but deep down, she already knew. There was no backing off. Not anymore. She reached for her phone and pulled up the anonymous email, staring at the words again. There was only one way to move forward. She needed to find out who had sent it, and she needed to do it fast. Nia stared at the email, her thumb hovering over the screen. Someone had gone out of their way to warn her. But who? And why now? Marcus leaned forward, tapping a finger on the table. You think it's someone inside Aero Atlantic? Maybe, Nia murmured. Or maybe someone who used to be inside. She pulled up her contacts and scrolled through names. There weren't many people she could trust with something like this, but there was one person who might have answers. Olivia Morgan, a former executive assistant at Langford Enterprises. Olivia had left under mysterious circumstances about a year ago. Rumors had swirled, something about an internal dispute, a sudden resignation. Nia had never known the full story, but if anyone had insight into Richard Langford's dealings, it was her. Without hesitating, she sent a message. Hey, Olivia, I need to talk. It's urgent. A few minutes passed before the three dots appeared. Meet me at Blue Orchid Cafe, 7 p.m. No calls. Nia exhaled. That wasn't the response of someone who was casually catching up. That was the response of someone who knew exactly what this was about. Marcus peered at her phone and let out a low whistle. Guess we're going on a field trip. The Blue Orchid Cafe was tucked away on a quiet street in downtown Manhattan. It was the kind of place where people held hushed conversations in dim corners, where the clink of ceramic cups blended with the occasional murmur of jazz from the speakers. Olivia was already there, seated in the back, a cappuccino in front of her. She looked the same, sharp, composed, but with an edge of caution in her gaze. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. You're in trouble. Nia slid into the seat across from her. I figured. Marcus sat beside her, folding his arms. You want to tell us why? Olivia took a slow sip of her coffee, then set the cup down. Richard Langford doesn't make empty threats. If he said he's going to ruin you, he's already put the wheels in motion. Nia kept her expression neutral, but her stomach tightened. How? Olivia hesitated, then leaned in. Let me guess. Suddenly you're under more scrutiny at Aero Atlantic? Small things at first? Maybe some negative performance reviews? A complaint from a passenger? Marcus let out a breath. Damn. Nia's mind raced. She hadn't checked her company emails since landing, but Olivia was right. If Richard was playing his game, the first steps would already be in motion. What's his endgame? Nia asked. Olivia's voice was quiet but firm. To make you unemployable. If he can't fire you outright, he'll build a case against you. Frame you as a liability, a risk. And then? Marcus asked. Olivia met Nia's eyes. Then he buries you. Nia had barely stepped off the train from Manhattan when her phone buzzed. Aero Atlantic Internal Memo. Captain Nia Caldwell. Performance Review. Notice. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't done anything wrong. Her record was clean. She tapped the notification and read, Captain Caldwell, due to recent concerns raised regarding passenger experience and procedural adherence, we will be conducting a formal review of your performance over the next 30 days. Her grip on the phone tightened. It was happening. She reached for Marcus's arm, showing him the screen. He let out a low curse. That was fast. Nia swallowed back the heat rising in her chest. He's setting me up. They walked toward the employee entrance of the terminal. As they passed through security, Marcus muttered, "You should tell someone higher up. Fight this before it gets worse." Nia let out a dry laugh. "Fight it with who? Langford owns half the people in that office." Marcus exhaled sharply. "Then we get ahead of it. We find proof that he's rigging this." Nia didn't answer. She was already thinking ahead. Who inside Aero Atlantic could be feeding Langford information? And who could she trust? She just hoped she had enough time to find out. Because if Olivia was right, this was only the beginning. The moment Nia stepped into the Aero Atlantic crew office, she could feel it. Something was off. Conversations quieted as she walked past. A few people avoided her gaze. She wasn't imagining it. The weight of suspicion was already settling in. She headed straight to her locker, pretending not to notice the way the assistant operations manager, Doug Hayes, glanced at her before whispering something to a colleague. Doug had never liked her. He was old school, the kind of guy who still believed pilots should fit a very specific mold. White, male, and preferably ex-military. She had made the mistake of calling him out on his biases once. She had a feeling he hadn't forgotten. As she reached for her bag, her phone buzzed again. New email, internal report, Captain Caldwell. Her stomach knotted as she opened it. Incident review, Flight 417, JFK ATL complaint, logged by first-class passenger, Richard Langford. Her breath caught. She read it twice, then a third time, just to make sure she wasn't seeing things. Passenger reports concerns regarding professionalism and in-flight experience. Claims include dismissive behavior, lack of adequate attention to passenger needs, and an overall negative interaction that reflects poorly on Aero Atlantic standards. Nia clenched her jaw so hard it ached. This was it. This was how he was going to do it. Slowly, piece by piece, crafting a narrative where she wasn't competent, wasn't professional. She forced herself to inhale deeply, shoving her phone into her pocket just as Marcus appeared beside her. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," he said. "Oh, it is." She exhaled, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "Langford filed a formal complaint. Claims I wasn't professional enough." Marcus cursed under his breath. This is how it starts. First, a concern, then they start digging deeper. Next thing you know, they'll say you're a liability to passenger safety. Nia nodded. "And once that happens, they ground me." She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let that happen. Marcus studied her, then said quietly, "What's the play?" She didn't hesitate. "We go after him first." Nia sat across from Daniel Cortez, the investigative journalist Marcus had put her in touch with. The cafe was nearly empty, the late hour keeping most of the usual crowd away. Daniel was sharp, mid-40s, with the look of someone who had seen too many lies and spent his career unraveling them. He had taken down corporate giants before, exposed corruption in places people swore were untouchable. Now he was listening to her story, nodding slowly as she spoke. "So Langford is setting you up," he murmured, tapping his pen against his notepad. "Not surprising. You're not the first." Nia straightened. "You know others?" Daniel leaned back. "Not pilots, but I've been following Langford for a while. His name comes up in places it shouldn't. Hidden dealings, political favors, financial manipulation. He's careful, though. No paper trail." Marcus crossed his arms. "That's great and all, but we need something solid. Something that proves he's coming after Nia." Daniel studied them both. Then after a moment he said, "I might have a lead." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages before turning the screen toward Nia. It was an address. "This is where you'll find Olivia Morgan. She went underground after she left Langford Enterprises. If anyone knows what he's capable of, it's her." Nia's pulse quickened. This was it, the first crack in Langford's armor. She just had to get to Olivia before he did. Nia gripped the steering wheel as she drove through the dimly lit streets of Brooklyn, Marcus beside her. The address Daniel had given them led to a small, nondescript apartment building tucked between a laundromat and a diner that had probably been there since the 70s. "This feels off," Marcus muttered, scanning the quiet street. "Are we sure she still lives here?" "We'll find out," Nia said, cutting the engine. They climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, stopping at apartment 2B. Nia knocked firmly. No response. She knocked again, glancing at Marcus. Then, just as she was about to try one last time, the door cracked open. A pair of wary brown eyes peeked out. Olivia Morgan. She looked different from the last time Nia had seen her. Her once polished business attire was replaced by a loose sweatshirt, her hair pulled into a messy bun. There was a tiredness in her face that hadn't been there before. "What are you doing here?" Olivia whispered, glancing past them as if expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. "We need to talk," Nia said. "It's about Langford." At the mention of his name, Olivia's face hardened. She hesitated, then opened the door just wide enough for them to slip inside. The apartment was sparse, boxes stacked in the corners, as if she was always ready to leave at a moment's notice. "You shouldn't have come," Olivia said, arms crossed. "If he finds out—" "He already knows I'm a problem," Nia interrupted. "But I'm not here for me. I'm here because I think you have something that could finally bring him down." For a long moment, Olivia just stared at her. Then slowly, she sank into a chair, rubbing a hand over her face. "You have no idea what you're up against." "Then tell me," Nia pressed. "Help me understand." Olivia let out a hollow laugh. "Langford doesn't just ruin people. He buries them. You think I left his company by choice?" She gestured around her apartment. "I lost everything because I wouldn't play his game." Nia and Marcus exchanged a look. Olivia sighed. "There's a file. Documents, transactions, emails, proof that he's been rigging airline contracts, bribing officials. I saved copies before I left, but I never had the power to do anything with them." Nia's heart pounded. "Where is it?" A shadow crossed Olivia's face. "It was on a secure drive. But a week ago, someone broke into my place. They didn't take anything except that." Marcus cursed under his breath. "He knows," Olivia whispered. "He knows I kept something." For the first time that night, fear flickered in her eyes. And Nia realized Richard Langford wasn't just trying to silence her. He was erasing every loose end. Nia sat in the driver's seat outside Olivia's apartment, staring at the city lights ahead. She had come looking for evidence, but instead, she had found something even more important: a witness. Marcus shifted beside her. "So what's the plan?" "Because I don't think Olivia's just going to walk into a courtroom and testify." "She doesn't have to," Nia murmured. "We just need to get her somewhere safe. If Langford's already cleaning up loose ends, she's running out of time." Marcus exhaled. "And then what?" "We're still empty-handed." Nia's grip tightened on the wheel. "Not yet." She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a number she hadn't dialed in years. Then before she could second-guess herself, she hit call. A few rings later, a voice answered. "I was wondering when you'd reach out." Nia swallowed. Ethan Briggs, former FAA investigator, a man who had built a career uncovering corruption in aviation before suddenly resigning under mysterious circumstances. "Are you still in the game?" she asked. A pause, then a quiet chuckle. "You asking because you need my help, or because you already know the answer?" Nia exhaled. "I have a witness, and I think she's in serious danger." Another silence. Then, "Meet me at Pier 45 tomorrow night, and bring her." The call ended. Marcus gave her a sidelong glance. "Tell me that's not a bad idea." Nia tucked her phone away. "It's our only shot." Because if Ethan Briggs had left the FAA for a reason, chances were that reason was Richard Langford, and he might just be the only person who could help them take him down. The Hudson River shimmered under the dim glow of streetlights as Nia, Marcus, and Olivia approached Pier 45. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and fuel from the nearby docks. The city hummed in the background, but here it was quiet, too quiet. "This feels like a setup," Marcus muttered, scanning the area. Olivia pulled her coat tighter around herself. "I shouldn't be here. If Langford finds out, he already knows," Nia cut in. "And that's exactly why we need to finish this." A shadow moved near the water. Then a figure stepped forward. Ethan Briggs. Even in the dim light, he was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, graying at the temples, the look of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. "You brought company," he said, eyeing Olivia. "She's the key," Nia said, "and we don't have time for games." Ethan studied Olivia for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Let's talk." They moved to a bench near the pier, away from prying eyes. Olivia hesitated, then pulled a flash drive from her pocket. This is what's left. Copies of emails, bank transactions. Not everything, but enough to start digging. Ethan took the drive, turning it over in his hand. Then he looked at Nia. You sure you want to do this? Her jaw tightened. I don't have a choice. Ethan exhaled. All right, then you need to be ready for what comes next. Because once this information went public, there would be no turning back. By noon the next day, the first headlines started appearing. Breaking. Business tycoon. Richard Langford, under investigation for corruption in aviation industry. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. Documents leaked to investigative journalists revealed a web of fraudulent contracts, illegal lobbying, and under-the-table deals that had gone unchecked for years. Langford's name was everywhere. By evening, Aero Atlantic announced an internal review, severing all ties with him. Nia sat in the crew lounge, watching the coverage unfold. Marcus leaned against the counter, shaking his head. Never thought I'd see the day. She barely heard him. She was too focused on the final segment airing on national news. Footage of FBI agents walking into Langford Enterprises, boxes in hand. And then, the image that sealed it all. Richard Langford, stepping into a black car, face grim, surrounded by agents. Marcus let out a low whistle. Damn. Nia didn't say anything. She had won. But somehow she knew this fight wasn't over yet. A week later, Nia walked into Aero Atlantic's headquarters for the first time since the scandal broke. Her suspension had been lifted. She stepped into the executive conference room, where the airline's board of directors sat waiting. Captain Caldwell, one of them said, we owe you an apology. She remained silent, letting them squirm. After a moment, another director cleared his throat. We'd like to offer you full reinstatement, effective immediately. Nia folded her arms. And? The man blinked. Excuse me? You want me back, she said. But what about everyone else? The people Langford blacklisted? The ones who never got a second chance? The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the chairman spoke. What are you asking for? Nia leaned forward. Change, real change. More pilots like me. More opportunities for people who earned their place. A long silence. Then slowly the chairman nodded. We can make that happen. Nia exhaled. Maybe for the first time they actually meant it. A month later, Nia sat in the cockpit of a Boeing 787, staring down the runway at JFK. The pre-flight checks were done. Marcus gave her a thumbs up from the cabin. Jim Carter's voice crackled through the headset. You ready? Nia adjusted her grip on the controls. Let's fly. She pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared to life. The aircraft surged down the runway, lifting off. Smooth, steady, unstoppable. Just like her. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought in boardrooms or courtrooms. They happen in the quiet moments when someone decides they won't back down. Nia Caldwell's story isn't just about taking on a powerful man. It's about breaking barriers, defying expectations, and proving that no amount of intimidation can silence those who refuse to be erased. So here's a question for you. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand your ground, even when the odds were stacked against you? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories of resilience, justice, and change coming your way. Stay tuned.